A warm welcome from Australian Friends of Rambam to everyone here live at Kehilat Nitzan Shul and those watching via YouTube in Australia and overseas to what promises to be an informative and thought-provoking Meet the Experts seminar on the benefits of medicinal cannabis. Australian Friends of Rambam is doubly excited for this first live Meet the Experts since 2019, having presented these events via Zoom over the past 2.5 years. I'm Paul Kessel, a board member at Australian Friends of Rambam, which was formed in 2018 to support and promote Rambam Healthcare Campus in Haifa, the largest hospital in the north of Israel, which provides comprehensive medical services across all medical specialties. Our Circle of Health program advocates improving health and the prevention of disease in Australians, providing a range of health and wellness activities, including this Meet the Experts series. To briefly introduce our speakers, we're very honoured to have here tonight leading figures and pioneers of the Australian and Israeli medicinal cannabis industries across the areas of production and cultivation, research on the role of cannabinoids under various disease conditions, and how medicinal cannabis is used with patients. So let me first introduce our chair, Professor Jonathan Cebon, who is the immediate past medical director of the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Wellness and Research Centre. Or you can just raise your hand. Our special guest on Zoom is Dr. Igal Louria-Hayon. He's the principal investigator and head of the Rambam Medical Cannabis Research and Innovation Centre. And our panellists are Peter Crock, the chairman of Medicinal Cannabis Industry Australia and the CEO of Can Group Limited, Rhys Cohen, the senior corporate communications manager at Can Group, and Tommy Huppert, the CEO of Canatrek Limited. I think we've also got via Zoom Associate Professor Vicky Kotsourelis, AM, an integrative GP and medical writer. Before we hand over, just say to everyone, we are always looking for volunteers, so if you want to speak to anyone with a badge like this afterwards, please do. If you want to make a donation, I think we have a donation tin over there, but can also be done on our website. So I just wanted to leave you with that, and also want to have an acknowledgement of country to elders past and present and the people of the Kulin Nation. So now I'll hand it over to Jonathan. Thank you. Look forward to an exciting panel.
Thank you very much, and welcome everyone to this evening's proceedings, which I think you'll find very interesting. Medicinal cannabis is something which has gained a lot of interest in recent years among medical researchers, among the community in general, and there's always an interesting challenge to separate the facts from the hype. And hopefully this evening will provide an opportunity to hear some perspectives in terms of the use of medicinal cannabis and its value, and in particular to hear some of the data from a leading researcher in Israel whose centre has been at the forefront of medicinal cannabis research. This evening's session will kick off with Tommy Huppert, who's the CEO of Canatrek Limited, one of the Australian producers of cannabis, a company that specialises in research, cultivation and manufacture of medicinal cannabis. And Tommy will talk to us initially about the promise, so paint the big picture in terms of medicinal cannabis and where he sees the future of the field. He'll be followed by Igal from Haifa, who will tell us about some of the research that's being done at the Rambam Centre, and then other Australian speakers, Peter Crock. In particular, we'll talk about the Australian perspective in terms of the industry, and during the question and answer session there'll be an opportunity to talk with the audience and to answer your questions. And for those of you who are watching on YouTube, if you could put your questions in the comment section, they'll be picked up online and transmitted to us and can then be discussed by the panel. So we'll start off with Tommy, who will tell us about his vision and the promise of medicinal cannabis.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'd like to thank the organisers, to Paul and to Jonathan and my colleagues Peter and Rhys for attending today. Okay, can everyone hear me now? No? Okay, I'll lift myself up a bit. Thank you to everyone, for the organisers and my colleagues for addressing tonight's event. It's certainly welcome to see everyone in person after being zoomed out for many years, so it's really wonderful. And also to have the online presence of our friends in Israel at the Rambam hospital, which is well known, and also the Australian Friends of Rambam, which is supported here. My talk today has been on the promise of medicinal cannabis, and I thought I'd open with a short conversation I had many years ago when I was in Israel, when I met a psychiatrist who was discussing with the health minister about putting medicinal cannabis on the equivalent of the PBS and or on an insurance scheme. And the answer was, cannabis is a plant, it's not a medicine. So that was a very strong statement that I heard from him at the time. And what has happened is medicinal cannabis is quite a new product which has been put into essentially a pharmaceutical regulatory environment. And myself and with my colleagues, Peter, we've been awarded licenses to really kickstart an industry, which is an old ancient industry, which has come back, and here we are 6 or 7 years later, and we're almost at ground zero. So a lot has happened in the last 6 or 7 years, and I thought today's talk, I might be able to give a little bit of the insights which I've had as one of the early licensees in developing and building a supply chain in Australia, and hopefully offering the promise of medicinal cannabis. The way I see this title is really better to describe it as the hope of medicinal cannabis, because we have so much work to do, so much research which is being conducted by institutions all around the world, and without doubt the collaboration of many industry players and stakeholders have been phenomenal. I've never seen this in any industry that I've been involved in over my career, but we certainly have a collaborative industry. Peter and I talk regularly and we text. I don't see any type of a competition in this industry. It's really, we're all here about helping patients have a better quality of life. So we have a lot of work to do, and I thought I'll be able to give some insights on my experiences in that journey. So we started the journey in 2016 when we applied for licenses, and soon after we were awarded, and we started very busily building our farms, which was a difficult job. It took a long time in terms of procuring equipment and people. As they say, Rome isn't built in a day, and the same thing with the medicinal cannabis industry. And a lot has happened over the last 6 or 7 years. It was a bit of a slow start, but we've had some incredible opportunities to work with government and stakeholders, with patients and doctors and institutions around the world to really focus on where should we be focusing our resources and our what we believe is able to achieve a better quality of life for patients. And the outcome of the early initiatives that we have embarked on has been the production of product here in Australia. It's been a bit of a slow start in terms of the ability for the supply chain in Australia. I would say probably in the last 12 to 18 months it's really developed quite remarkably. And there are some farms, not many in Australia, which are actually working day and night, 24/7, looking after little baby plants that go through a life cycle of about 3 months before they actually reach the patient after 4 to 6 months of processing through a pharmaceutical supply chain. We, as a organisation, we get inundated daily with many inquiries, whether it's patients curious to know about this product for themselves or family members, or patients who are on the different products which are now in the what we call the special access scheme pathway. And to give you an example, we receive well over 500 phone calls a day of inquiries. It is quite a bottleneck, and we've had to scramble to listen to patients, to talk to patients. As an example, there might be a patient that finds it difficult to open a tincture or understand the titration. So there's so much information that is required to support patients, to answer the queries about where I should go, what doctor I should see. So the hope of medicinal cannabis I think is more appropriate than the promise at this stage. I don't think we can promise anything. We have to rely on a bit more data, which is really coming through now. As of, I believe, I think Reese might be able to help me with this, but we're well over 100,000 patients, I believe, in Australia who are using medicinal cannabis. So it's not a handful like it was in 2019. It took about 3 or 4 months to get an approval at that time for one patient, with hours and hours of work between GP, the TGA, and doctors. Now the process has been streamlined with a lot of advocacy through my colleagues and other stakeholders. This is really a grassroots movement which we can see all over the world. I believe at the time, about 6 years ago, Israel was probably the only country which had a medicinal cannabis regime, and Australia looked very much to the pros and cons of how they rolled out that regime. We looked to Canada, and here we are in Australia, which I believe we have quite a unique place in the world for research to develop and be able to look at the data of some of the research in terms of the different medical indications that patients are seeking support through. These are mainly anxiety, pain, sleep, and other disorders. The main area which we see a lot of inquiries is around sleep and anxiety. Probably it's been induced by the unfortunate period of COVID over the last few years. There's a lot of questions as to whether youth are able to access medicinal cannabis, in what forms, because there's many cannabinoids in medicinal cannabis as a category. So there's so many moving parts. You may have heard of some online discussions about whether you can drive after using medicinal cannabis. It really is limiting some of the fields, whether it's first responders or general people in careers, how they can go to work if they've had medicinal cannabis the night before. So there's still a lot of stigma and undoing of really understanding the risk associated with prescribing, dosages and limitations. Cannatrek, in our experience today, have treated and maybe I'll rephrase that. We've supported and prescribed through various doctors over 20,000 patients. So we have an incredible amount of data that is coming through that we're trying to collate and be able to support some more real-world evidence in terms of feedback from patients. We get every day or every few days what we call an appreciation bomb, which comes out of nowhere. It could be an email, a text from patients who say, this has just changed my life. I can sleep after a few years, or I've been using this particular medicine with no effect, and suddenly, almost overnight, my knee or my shoulder is just suddenly the pain is gone. These are the type of data, or what we call real-world evidence, we're trying to really understand and bring some science and authenticity to the promise or the hope of medicinal cannabis. The business model that we have thought to initiate in Australia is really a supply chain. And I know that my colleague Peter will talk a bit about it, because it's really hard to start an industry where nothing exists. I remember one of my first discussions was with Reese in 2016, I think. I was looking for a consultant, and Reese was, I think, the only person in Australia who was actually around that I could talk to. That was our that was our industry, a handful of people. So it is certainly developed considerably. I believe there's well over 1,000, if not more. I might be underestimating, Peter, the amount of people involved in the industry today in Australia. There's certainly been lots of investment in terms of research and trial and error. As you know, in any new industry, mistakes have to be made to learn, and we've all had our experience of difficulties in supply chains or procuring the right lights in greenhouses. But it certainly has been an exciting development of old industry which is actually coming back to the forefront. What does it mean for the future? The promise of medicinal cannabis, I believe that this is a therapeutic product which has that can affect many medical indications as a parallel or even a frontline treatment. At the moment, it's treated as a second treatment option if other existing treatments aren't really working, but the mainstream and uptake from doctors has been incredible. There's well over 1,000 approved prescribers who have gone through the course, which is essentially an upgrade of understanding the endocannabinoid system, which wasn't taught in medical school. So there's a big job for education of GPs and doctors and specialists, and that's what companies like ourselves and Canberra and others are working very hard to educate doctors, to explain the experiences that we've had. And we're finding now that there actually is a real industry, and I believe that the future success of the industry is continued collaboration and really understanding the data that we're getting anecdotally and be able to talk with different medical practitioners in different areas of indications where we can contribute to the health and well-being of their patients. So on that note, I'm going to pass on the mic back to Jonathan and look forward to any questions in our panel discussion later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Tommy. We'll hold the questions until the panel discussion. I think the important early insight that you made was that discussion that it's not a drug, it's a plant. And I guess the challenge with dealing with the plant is it's a complex mixture of biological or bioactive agents, and to figure out how to use it is an interesting research challenge. And we're fortunate to be joined by Igal from Rambam in Haifa, who heads the Cannabis Research and Innovation Centre. Igal is, in addition to a cannabis researcher, someone who's interested in leukemia and immunology. So he has a very solid scientific background, and so to bring the rigour of a scientific career to the interesting challenge of how to analyse the bioactive effects of cannabis is, I think, an important thing to be able to do, and I think we're very fortunate to have him join us to tell us about the research that they're doing at Rambam. Igal, thank you.
Thank you. Hello everyone. I'm glad to join you today and to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to take part in this discussion. Before I begin, if I may, I would like to introduce myself and provide a bit of a background to my current work. My name is Igal, and I completed my PhD dissertation in cancer research at the Hebrew University. I then traveled to Toronto as a postdoc fellow at Mount Sinai Hospital in Canada. And in Canada, my main focus was on cell signaling and cell communication. 8 years ago, we returned to Israel, and I established my laboratory for immunotherapy and cancer signaling at Rambam Healthcare Campus. Rambam, as you know, is one of the biggest hospitals in Israel, located in Haifa. 5 years ago, I started to study cannabis in our laboratory in order to understand its working mechanism. And 3 years ago at Rambam, we established the Medical Cannabis Research Center. And now let's talk about medical cannabis. I would like to begin with this graph that presents the number of Israelis which hold license for use of medical cannabis. As you see, the number doubled itself in the last 2 years from 50,000 to more than 112 patients. And of course, we believe that this growth will continue. In Israel, 60% of patients using cannabis are categorized as suffering from chronic pain. About 25% are oncology and chemotherapy patients, and the rest use cannabis for various of diseases like autoimmune, epilepsy, autism, etc. You can therefore clearly understand that most of the patients which use cannabis are considered complex patients that probably apply other drugs in tandem with cannabis. Another interesting piece of information is that about 14% of patients using cannabis are older than 70 years old, which again emphasize the need to study and understand how cannabis works while patients are obtaining other drugs. And this is one of the reasons why, as a hospital, we have decided to invest effort in deepening our knowledge about cannabis. This is a main purpose for us at the Medical Cannabis Research Center. In the hub of the center, there is a state-of-the-art laboratory. The lab applies human samples from our biobank and uses a variety of disease models to study the effect of cannabis on pathological conditions. In the first stage of our research, we identified the mechanism of work of cannabis on specific disease model. Once we have the mechanism in hand, and only then, we continue to the clinical experiment, which will be based on scientific data. And this is the vision of the center, scientific-based clinical trials. In the last 5 years, we were all exposed to publications in the general media, which talked about the potential of cannabis in many pathological conditions, such as cancer, asthma, autism, pain relief, Alzheimer, post-traumatic stress disorder, glaucoma, migraines, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, epilepsy, etc. And the question is, how could it be that one plant can affect so many different pathological conditions, even if its effect may be for palliative purpose or the reduction of some disease manifestation? Still, it is an extraordinary potential of one plant. To answer this question, we have to understand how cannabis works in and on our body. Professor Mishulam from Israel had showed that our body produces molecules which are similar to the cannabinoids in the plant. And these molecules interact with receptors on the cell membrane. This interaction actually sends the message into the cell. This system was termed the endocannabinoid system. So what we have here is the system that actually creates interaction, a communication between two cells. One cell produces and secretes the endocannabinoid, and another cell accepts the cannabinoid by way of expression the receptors, and finally reacts to the message. What we know now today is that the cannabinoids that the cannabis plant produces are similar to the endocannabinoid. For this reason, phytocannabinoids can interact with cell receptors and send messages that influence the cell purpose, its fate, and activities. And this is actually the basic of the capacity of the cannabis to influence the cells. For a long time, the nervous system was considered as the main system which expresses the receptors and thus the main system which is affected by cannabis. However, in time, we learned that many organs and cells in our body express receptors for cannabinoids. For example, we have receptors in our lungs, in the bones, in the liver, in the spleen, in the immune system. Actually, today, it is difficult to find an organ which doesn't express receptors for cannabinoids. And this is probably the reason why, at least theoretically, we can understand how and why cannabis may have a potential to influence so many diseases. Since cannabis works through activating receptors, and since the receptors are located in a variety of organs, when such an organ is involved in a disease, then cannabis it may have the potential to affect the disease manifestation. It all sounds very promising, but the problem is that the cannabis plant produces many different cannabinoids. Actually, there are about 150 different cannabinoids, and the different strains represent different ratio of the expressed cannabinoid. So for every disease, we have to reveal which strain contains the optimal cannabinoids composition for a specific purpose. On the other hand, we have variety of receptors which have the potential to interact with cannabinoids. And it's not only two receptors, as it was thought in the beginning. It's not only CB1 and CB2. In our lab, we are studying these days the expression levels of 12 different cannabis receptors. So you can imagine now the complexity of revealing which cannabinoid interacts with which receptor in the context of a specific disease. As you understand now, a chosen strain can influence, for example, the immune system or the nervous system, but it will depend on the cannabinoid compounds of the strain and the kind of receptors which are expressed on the cells. Let me talk shortly through one experiment we have done recently. In order to initiate an inflammation process in response to a virus, for example, our body recruits about 15 different immune cells. Their activity is synchronized due to highly regulated cell communication system. The cells express and secrete molecules which are called cytokines, and these molecules interact with receptors on the other immune cells and send signal to activate it. These signals regulate the migration of the immune cell to the site of the inflammation. They regulate the proliferation of the cells, their toxicity activity against the virus, and in the end, they regulate the death of the immune cells. Some of these molecules are critical to the inflammation process. For example, the IL-6 and the TNF-alpha. Our studies, therefore, aim to reveal a cannabis strain which interrupts the inflammation process by reducing the secretion of critical molecules which are involved in cell communication during inflammation. Our first step was to examine the effect of cannabis oil extracted from 6 different strains. 3 of them high THC and 3 of them contains high CBD levels. And we examined the effect of these strains on the secretion of IL-6 molecule by the immune cell. This experiment revealed first that we have differences between the different strains, and it revealed one specific strain that had a significant influence on the secretion of IL-6, which is a critical step in the inflammation process. So we chose to continue with this strain in our study. Next, we applied neutrophils isolated from human donors, peripheral blood, and showed that this strain can reduce the secretion of two critical molecules, the IL-6 and the TNF-alpha. Because the oil is a full-spectrum high CBD oil, we've tested whether purified CBD may have the same anti-inflammatory effect. And it was interesting to see in our hand that, as you see here, only the whole extract oil reduced the IL-6 and the TNF, while the purified molecule CBD didn't have effect on these cells in this experiment. Here we concluded and showed that in this case, whole spectrum oil is actually better than purified CBD. With COVID-19 pandemic, it was shown that patients with severe disease had presented high inflammation storm with enhanced elevation of IL-6, TNF-alpha, and other cytokines. These patients also developed severe lung inflammation, and in the lung fluid, it was found again high levels of IL-6 and TNF-alpha. Thus, we thought that we may have a strain with the potential to reduce both inflammation storm and lung inflammation, which are related to COVID-19 disease. To examine this potential, we applied a mouse model for severe systemic inflammation, which resembles an inflammation storm. We treated the mice with our cannabis oil, and as you see, it seems that the oil significantly reduced the inflammation molecule in the mice blood plasma. We continue with our investigation and applied another model for lung inflammation. And we tested the levels of IL-6 and the TNF-alpha in the lungs fluid. And again, we found significant reduction of IL-6 and TNF-alpha in mice treated with the oil. They also showed reduction of the inflammation in the lungs. Hence, our experiment revealed a cannabis oil which can intervene the immune cell communication system by reducing the capacity to secrete IL-6, TNF-alpha, and we know today also about other critical cytokines. And this is, we believe, how we can interrupt the process of severe inflammation. On the basis of this data, we recently applied to the Ministry of Health in Israel for a clinical trial in hospitalized COVID-19 patients in order to examine if this oil can prevent clinical deterioration in patients with moderate to severe COVID-19 disease, along with standard of care treatment. I would like to thank my team and our collaborators for the work, and thank you all for listening.
I'm not sure which of these I'm supposed to be using. David, both?
Just use the mobile one.
That's the mobile one. Thanks, Igal. We'll come to some questions later, but obviously some fascinating prospects for the anti-inflammatory effects of cannabinoids, especially given Israel's involvement in the evaluation of anti-COVID strategies. So I don't know if you've got any data to share with us yet, but that's certainly a fascinating area to consider. The next speaker is Peter Kroc. Peter is the chairman of the industry association that is responsible for production of cannabis in Australia, and he'll talk a little bit about the industry and the regulatory environment and some of the challenges and promises of cannabis manufacturing in Australia. Peter.
Terrific, thanks Jonathan. Hi everyone. Great to be here on a Sunday night, and then Vicky's talking after me. Is she? Yeah.
Vicky will join the Q&A.
Oh, terrific, excellent. So in terms of giving you some, and thanks Tommy for the lead-in, we've definitely had a good introduction to what's happening in medicinal cannabis in Australia. The story with a bit more focus on the regulatory environment to explain what it is that the hoops we've had to run through and what we've been working on. Victoria actually led the way in Australia with medicinal cannabis. We had the Victorian Law Reform Commission in 2015 where they were looking to try and improve access or address the issue of patient access for medicinal cannabis. As Tommy said, it's got a long history, and other parts of the world have been working. Israel led the way, Canada as well, working with medicinal cannabis. And Victoria picked up the baton and ran with it in 2015. The federal government actually stepped in over the top though and brought in federal legislation because Australia, as you might know, are the leading producer of alkaloids or opiates for pain management in Australia. In the world, sorry. We still produce over half of the opiates that are used around the world out of the poppy industry that came here after the Second World War and set up in Tasmania to start with. So under the UN Single Convention on Narcotics, Australia being a signatory to that, it's a requirement that the federal government regulate anything that happens in the narcotics area, and they were very keen to ensure that we didn't interrupt our opiate industry by having a medicinal cannabis industry established that would be counter to the requirements of the UN Single Convention. So it was in early 2016, in fact on my birthday, 23rd of February, that the legislation came into effect in Australia. The Office of Drug Control was formed within the Department of Health. So the TGA, the head of the TGA, John Skerritt, that both Tommy and I know well, in fact the whole industry knows well, has under his control both the pharmaceutical manufacturing requirements of the Therapeutics Goods Administration and also the ODC, the Office of Drug Control. They came into effect on the 30th of October and in fact my history, so I just give you a quick background. I had a long career at New Farm in agricultural chemicals. I'm an agricultural scientist by training background. After I left there in early 2016, joined Can Group, and we were one of the first to, and in fact Can Group had started to work on the opportunity as it had come to light with the Victorian government. They raised some early money, gave it back when the business model was no longer going to be appropriate because of the federal government requirements. They'd raised over $1 million, gave it back to the investors, and then relaunched a business model focused on the federal requirements. And anyway, that's ancient history for this industry. 2016, I joined in early 2016. October came, the Office of Drug Control came into effect, and we put our 2 licence applications in on the day, and in fact were the first to be issued with a licence out of the Office of Drug Control in February and March 2017 we got going. We provided the first material to the Victorian government. They had a paediatric epilepsy cohort that they were looking for product for. We produced for them and provided it to them. And then it was probably in 2018 that it was clear that we needed an industry association as well, and the first 6 licence holders came together and put the MCIA in place as an industry association to ensure that we could provide a voice to the regulator and to the government that was not just seen as an individual company voice, but provided some input on that front, and that's been pivotal to make sure that that we had an establishing industry, that also we put in place a code of conduct and various other pieces that are required to ensure that that we get going. As Tommy said, back in 2018, I think we had something like 320 patients that had been provided access to medicinal cannabis under the special access scheme that he mentioned. So medicinal cannabis is being dealt with as an unregistered medicine, quite forward-thinking of the government, in that there wasn't any body of work, and in fact at the time worldwide there was only one product that had been registered as a medicinal cannabis product as a true pharmaceutical. So in Australia here we had the special access scheme as the process that we could have provide access to patients, and that now has well over 100,000 patients have come through. The process was streamlined, as Tommy said, and that is the basis of how patients get access to medicinal cannabis. Vicky later on will probably, and Reece can talk to the Q&A of how doctors are interacting with patients and prescribing medicinal cannabis. Where to next? I'm thinking in terms of, let me just have a look here. I think we've covered the timeline and we're up to, sorry, one other thing I will talk about in terms of the regulations is that I mentioned before that TGA have a role to play as well. Under the legislation, products produced by Australian licensed producers have to be produced to GMP, good manufacturing practice, and that's a requirement that ensures, and it's used for all medicines that are provided in Australia as registered medicines, that they've got meet. Australia is one of the leading standards around the world. You've got the FDA in the US. The Europeans have a similar body, the MRA, in I think it is in the UK. So Australia's TGA is definitely a world standard pharmaceutical requirements under good manufacturing practice, and that's a requirement for anything that's produced in Australia has to be produced to GMP as well. So the role for the TGA is important. In the early days, to ensure that patient access wasn't being limited, the government did allow imports, and the imports coming in needed to be produced, or the only test that was in place was called Therapeutic Goods Order 93, TGO 93, which actually remained silent on GMP. So for the establishing industry, it has been somewhat problematic in that there's been a lower quality requirement for imports compared to Australian produced product. But the TGA have now made a change to that. From July next year, imports have to have equivalent quality as Australian product. One other one just to touch on was back in 2018, Minister Greg Hunt allowed exports. When the system was first set up, they decided not to allow exports because they wanted to ensure that there was full compliance and no diversion of product. With the exports, they also have to be to a GMP standard. Nothing can leave Australia that's not to our GMP standard, but that actually stands us in very good stead in international markets where there are requirements for pharmaceutical grade product. So I think they're probably the key things around the industry and where we're at, and we can...
People may not be familiar with what GMP means. Do you want to just quickly...
So good manufacturing practice, GMP, is the standard that's required for any product that's sold in Australia or prescribed in Australia as a registered medicine. So to attain a GMP standard is it's a quality system, basically, is at the core of it, and it's all about consistency, safety, and a product being registered in Australia must show quality, safety and efficacy are the three things, and the quality is governed by good manufacturing practice requirements. It's a worldwide standard that's recognised by all of the key regulatory players, so that's good manufacturing practice. What is interesting, and I think is something we'll get into in the Q&A around the clinical data and the evidence required to register a medicine, is the other big piece of the puzzle we're looking to work on. Because we're working largely with unregistered medicines, but probably from a broader perspective, because of prohibition in nearly every jurisdiction around the world, there's a dearth of clinical data to support the use of medicinal cannabis. There's been a lot of anecdotal evidence and real-world evidence, but not a lot of clinical data that's been generated. That is starting to change, but it definitely has been because it's prohibited, and funnily enough, the US, it's still federally illegal. Medicinal cannabis, even though you hear about cannabis use right throughout North America, it's still federally illegal. So none of the major teaching hospitals or research organisations, when I say none, there's a handful that are, but the bulk of them won't and can't touch medicinal cannabis because it's federally illegal. So again, it puts Australia in a very strong position, and Israel, both leading the way in terms of very small countries in the scheme of things, but definitely leading the way in terms of what we can do with the clinical data being generated around medicinal cannabis. Is that a good start, yep. Jonathan? We can head to a Q&A shortly.
All right, good. Now, is Vicky on the line yet? No, not yet. So she's going to join us at 8 o'clock. So I think, so Vicky Kitsarelis, I'll introduce her to you now while we're waiting for her to come online. Is a general practitioner who has a lot of experience with the prescribing of medicinal cannabis and a long-standing interest in complementary medicine. Unfortunately, she wasn't able to join the session in person tonight, but said she'd come in via Zoom and would be able to, I think, address a lot of the questions that may arise regarding clinical application in the Australian setting and the experience with the clinical use of cannabis. David, perhaps you could indicate to me when she... She's there now?
Should we just press on and she can...
Yeah.
Her name, can you mention her name first?
Vicky Kitsarelis.
Would the name pop up there?
Okay.
Hello.
Good.
Hi, it's Vicky here.
Hi, Vicky. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. I'm delighted that you could make it despite the other commitments that you've got this weekend. We've just had a few talks from some speakers about medicinal cannabis, about some of the challenges at an industry level and some of the challenges at a research level. We haven't yet heard from someone who prescribes medicinal cannabis, and you're probably one of the most experienced practitioners in the country in terms of the clinical application in a general practice setting. I guess one of the questions that has arisen, and I'll kick off with this, is with a complex mixture like medicinal cannabis, where there are different strains and multiple cannabinoids and multiple clinical indications, it's a real challenge to navigate the disease indications and the choice of product in terms of what you prescribe for an individual patient who you're presented with. So I'd be really interested in perhaps you just talking about your experience in that problem, how you grapple with the choices that you need to make in terms of prescribing and how you select the right product for the right indication.
Sure. Okay. Firstly, I'm not the highest prescriber of medicinal cannabis in Australia. I'm quite cautious how I prescribe medicinal cannabis. It's an unregistered drug, and it's used as a last resort when all other treatments have failed. It's very important that when patients present to us, we take on a holistic and ensure that we advise them on the right lifestyle and behavioural changes that are required to help their disease. So, for example, if stress, poor diet, poor sleep, etc., contributors to diseases, then we attend to those factors first. And we also look at what else they've tried. Then, if at the end of that, you do require to prescribe medicinal cannabis, then there are checklists that I go through before I consider it. So the first is what we're treating. The number one reason why doctors prescribe medicinal cannabis in Australia is for chronic pain. And when we look at all the conditions, most of them, there's some sort of pain factor involved. So whether that's cancer-related pain or chronic non-cancer-related pain like neuropathic pain or fibromyalgia, chronic migraines, or any other pain condition. The second reason why patients seek doctors for medicinal cannabis is for mental health problems such as anxiety, and then third comes insomnia. And then there are other conditions after that. So, for example, behavioural-related diseases associated with autism or ADHD or other. So now to backtrack, to answer your question, if after all that, and they've trialled everything, and all the treatments have failed, and we think about medicinal cannabis, the first thing is to think about the patient and prescribing it safely. So most formulas predominantly contain THC, CBD. A number of formulas also contain other ingredients. There are multiple other ingredients found in those medicinal cannabis products. What I generally try to do is start patients on whole spectrum CBD first. CBD is not your number one treatment for pain, but the advantage, if they do gain benefit with CBD, is one, they can drive. Because in Australia, if you're taking THC and it's detected on a celebrity test, on a roadside test by the police, then you could lose your license, at this stage. And obviously we want those laws to change for various reasons. Now, if after the whole spectrum CBD does not work, then I will consider escalating and start adding low doses of THC. But if a patient presents to me with severe pain, for example, cancer-related pain, metastatic pain, severe neuropathic pain, then I will introduce the THC fairly early on in the prescribing and maybe even from the first visit. But always starting at a low dose of THC. My experience has been that if patients are not using illicit cannabis, what we call naive patients, in other words, they're not using marijuana, cannabis, etc., they're very sensitive to low doses. And fortunately, my clinical experience, I have witnessed firsthand patients responding to really low doses of medicinal cannabis, together with all the lifestyle and behavioural advice that I've provided patients, that holistic approach of treating them. So not just focusing on the drug treatment. So the idea or the concept is to start low and go slow. So, for example, the commonest medicinal cannabis product that I use is an oil and orally, and that is actually the case. Majority of doctors in Australia, the majority of doctors in Australia prescribe medicinal cannabis oils. And the best way to start is start low, go slow. So, for example, starting at 0.5 to 1 mil. Sponsors often write 2.5 mils, but I go even lower. And then every 3 days, if there's no response, clinical benefits, then I advise them to incrementally go up by 1 mil every 3 days, if required, till they gain the clinical benefits. If they experience a side effect, such as drowsiness or nausea or any other side effect that we don't expect, I ask them to reduce the dose to the dosage that doesn't cause a side effect. If it has a clinical benefit, we may continue on that low dose. From my clinical experience, I have found that the majority of patients have clinical benefits fairly early on, even as low as 0.5 mil a day. It's very rare that I've had patients go beyond 1 mil, even with low doses of THC. The advantage of identifying the lowest dose possible also means that that bottle lasts longer and it's cost effective for the patient. And that's important because they're expensive products. So that's why I follow the principle and I encourage doctors to start with the principle of start low, go low as possible dose of THC if it's required for that chronic refractory severe pain, such as the metastatic cancer pain we talked about. And then if they're not responding to those products, I then choose the next product that has a high level of THC. So I'm going up and the ratio might become 1:1. So, for example, 10 milligrams of CBD to 10 milligrams of THC per mil. And if required, higher THC levels. Majority of times I've not needed to escalate to those very high levels. And I know there are doctors who use very high levels, but I think we have to be careful with THC, not just for driving. The issue with THC as we escalate is the psychoactive effect. And the studies have changed. It used to be 25 to 30 milligrams per day might trigger off psychosis, but it's thought to be more like 40 milligrams now. But nonetheless, I try to avoid getting to that stage to ensure that the patient is safe. Now, the other area really important is drug interactions. So we don't want patients who are taking antidepressants, other analgesics like benzodiazepines, opioids, having an additive effect. So in those situations, I work with the patient to start reducing the opioids and benzodiazepines. So even This week, I saw a patient with a very severe pain condition of her leg. It's called complex, it's a neuropathic pain. It's a nerve pain that she had in her leg. And when I found that her pain started to reduce with the small dose of THC into the CBD, the first thing we did was start to reduce her endo, which is an analgesic, which is a painkiller. So there is a role for the THC combined with the CBD to start reducing opioids, which we know land a lot of patients, a lot of people in hospitals. So the medicinal cannabis can be what we call opioid sparing. So in other words, we can try to reduce those much more dangerous pharmaceuticals that increase the risk of falls and deaths, etc., by using medicinal cannabis. I think I've sort of given you an overview of how I approach it and the general sort of problems I see. Another condition that I really find benefit is fibromyalgia. And I use whole spectrum CBD, and rarely do I use a small dose of THC, but I will use some THC if it's to help sleep at night, because what we find is that patients wake up feeling up a lot more refreshed and less pain. All right. I'm happy to take questions if I've missed anything.
Okay, thanks, Vicky. That's been extremely helpful. I guess one of the points that's emerged really relates to dosing and choice of drugs, and the fact that there's a lot of tailoring required for individual patients. And Tommy, you mentioned this as well in terms of dosing and the anecdotal experience that you've reported, but also the fact that you're collecting data. And I wonder how you collect data when there's so many variables. I mean, data's easy to collect if things are straightforward, if everyone's getting the same dose and everyone's getting the same drug and everyone's got the same sort of diagnosis. But when there's so many variations and variables, how do you collect data in a way which can inform the development of the field? Is this something that you're set up to do, and what's the approach?
It's a very topical question. As I mentioned, we've prescribed to over 20,000 patients, and we're really at the point of how we're going to collate and really understand and deliver it back to doctors who really would like to see that information. So one of the projects we're working on is what we call a feedback loop, where we literally ask the patients, get them to document, I had 0.5 milligrams of this particular product, and how did it affect me in the morning? So to get the immediate feedback. So I look at what we call real world evidence and collating that at one side, and the other side is clinical trials, which we know is very expensive, takes a long time, and when you're dealing with 20, 30, 100, 200 patients, as Peter probably knows, in terms of the S3 opportunity that is before us, it's very different when you have anecdotal data of thousands and thousands of patients. So data is king, as we know, and it is a very big challenge ahead of us to collate the data which comes directly from the patient and to essentially pass it back to the prescriber, the doctor, to make informed decisions.
Can I say something on that? Sorry. Hi everyone. I just want to share, talking about dosage and some of the challenges with dosing. So my mum recently started using medicinal cannabis. She's had horrible restless leg syndrome for her whole life and really horrible sleep. And a few months ago, I sent her to a sleep specialist that I know, and she got prescribed medicinal cannabis oil. And this was very exciting. And for me, I was very excited for her. But one of the challenges that she had was she she's not, her hands aren't very strong these days. She's got a bit of arthritis, so she, struggled with the oil in the jar, but also her eyes aren't very good. And with the oil, you're meant to sort of extract a specific, amount of oil using the syringe. And basically, eventually, she just started taking a little bit every day because she couldn't really, it was just too hard for her, essentially. So like there's benefits to being prescribed an oil product because it does allow you to incrementally increase your dose, which is useful, but there's also downsides because for some people it's not a very useful or easy way to use a medicine. But that's why I think it's good we've got a variety of products available to be prescribed in Australia now. So you have oils, you also have products that you can inhale, and there are also capsules and tablets and other products that look more like a normal medicine might look like. Yeah.
Can I just add on? Prescribing and the dosages is very individualised, and it depends on one patient to another, and that's what makes it really hard with trials. It's not like a pharmaceutical drug where you're looking at one dosage. So some people are more sensitive than others, and some are restricted and others are not. And then others are more escalated, whereas others can lower doses. And that's why I find people where you can alter the dose concentration as we go along.
Did you want to comment?
Yeah, I was Vicky. Yeah, sorry, there's a bit of a delay between the voice and the video. So Tommy mentioned S3 before, and I was also just going to touch on the TGA and how they deal with real-world evidence. So the S3 is low-dose CBD. So the TGA decided, or it was put to them, and they looked at allowing a low-dose CBD product to be registered in Australia or to be started through that process. They initially put a 60 milligrams per day limit.
Over the counter.
So S3 is for over-the-counter or pharmacy distribution. So it doesn't require a doctor's prescription, but it does have to be supplied through a pharmacy, but it's called over-the-counter, so you have to go in and deal with a pharmacist, healthcare professional. You can't just pick it up off the shelf, but it can be accessed without a prescription. They started at 60 milligrams. The Industry Association actually put a submission together and got that changed to 150 milligrams a day. 60 was chosen by the TGA initially because they wanted to ensure it was safe. And we said, yes, absolutely, it'll be safe at 60 milligrams because it won't do anything at 60 milligrams. So we at least got it changed to 150 milligrams. And there are a number of companies now, Can is one of them, that have started the process of getting a submission ready to go into the TGA, which, as Vicky pointed out, is based on a clinical trial program with very precise dosing requirements. So Can have a capsule that we've developed or we acquired, but we now have that technology. It actually was an Australian and Israeli genesis, Satifarm, that was done out of a project that was done here in Australia and Israel, and we have put a trial program together, and that we're still recruiting patients for that at the moment. On the real world evidence side, I was just going to touch on the TGA's requirements there, and it's interesting with COVID because it actually has changed markedly over the COVID period, but the idea of generating or collecting data from patients that's not within a clinical trial program, they're actually very reticent to do that, and historically and still have been very conservative about recognising the value of patient data where it's not from a controlled clinical trial program. That is changing, and in fact even in the process of, and Jonathan can talk to this more than I, from the Olivia Newton-John Cancer Research Institute, I'm aware that, with early trial work we were doing there with Jonathan, clinical trials have historically all been paper-based, and you couldn't collate data unless it was literally written down and collected that way. COVID's changed that dramatically so that now patients can even give a voice signature, whereas before it used to be all on paper. So we're moving in the right direction in terms of being able to collate and collect data and make use of it, but there's still a long way to go, and at this stage the TGA are still, I think, in somewhat of a holding pattern around whether they will in fact accept real-world evidence to support a regulatory submission.
Can I have a question, please, to Peter?
Sure.
If the TGA approve private practitioners, do you know if hospitals, I'm asking for my son, he has an anxiety disorder, and he's under the treatment of Alfred. So he could go to a private practitioner, but it cost him a fortune if he's on a pension. Cost him a fortune. So they gave him a bottle for a month. So he finished the bottle, as the doctors just said, in 2 days. Now, if they approve private practitioners, do they approve hospitals to prescribe it? Because I spoke with the psychiatrist in Alfred.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm speaking to David loud enough.
This is for the recording.
Okay. So his psychiatrist in the Alfred agreed with me. She actually said it will help him. None of the medication that we give him helps. But she can't prescribe it. So she sent him to a private practitioner. She gave him a list. But to go to the private practitioner, it's $120 for a bottle that's supposed to be enough for a month. So he goes down Chapel Street and buys it for nothing. But what he buys there, I don't know. So where are we stuck now? Are hospitals providing it as well as a public medical service, or they're forcing these poor mentally ill people that they know medication doesn't help because they tried everything, including private psychiatrists, and I didn't save of nothing, but I'm stuck.
That's awful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. My understanding, and I'm not certain, but my understanding is that it's essentially up to the hospital and the hospital's policy as to whether they will cover specific medicines. And in my experience, the hospitals that I've interacted with about this issue are very hesitant to finance access to these medicines because they haven't gone through clinical trials to prove that they're effective yet. Right. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. So the part of the challenge is that almost none of the medicinal cannabis products in the world at the moment are actually considered medicines by the regulatory bodies because they haven't gone through clinical trials to prove that they're effective for treating a specific condition. So, the 100,000 Australians, for example, that are accessing a medicinal cannabis product at the moment are accessing products that haven't been proven to be effective. They work, but they haven't been proven to work sufficient to convince the government and the hospitals that they're value for money. And that's part of the obligation of the medicinal cannabis industry is to invest in clinical research, because that's the only way you're going to provide affordable access to people who actually need it. But as we were saying, we're 100 years behind where we should be with the evidence base with medicinal cannabis, and it'll take a long time for us to get there. But I'm really encouraged by some of the clinical evidence that's been coming out around, in particular, young people and mental health and anxiety and other conditions, especially with CBD. There's some interesting and promising research there. But I'm sorry to say, I think it will be some time before people in your son's situation will actually be able to be provided with their medicine in the hospital framework.
Another question, a quick question. So the CBD that you give to pain is the same CBD or that you give for anxiety?
So the question is, the CBD that you provide for pain is the same CBD that you use for anxiety, and the answer is yes. CBD is a molecule that's found in cannabis, as our colleagues were saying, it has lots of different effects on the body. So it might interact with people's inflammation, or it might interact with their anxiety or their sleep. It's a very broad class of drugs. Yeah.
Is Igal still on the line? Is
Hi,
Igal?
yes.
He's here.
Igal, look, we were talking about data collection, and I know that there have been some initiatives out of Israel looking at real-world data and collecting data from patients and trying to match that with biochemical analysis of products. Would you like to just address that, just to tell the audience about the work that's been going on over there?
Yeah, I can tell you what is happening in our hospital. We actually at Rambam we have about 5,000 patients with the license for cannabis, but there was no real documentation of these people except in the health of in the Ministry of Health. So now we started to add the first when the doctor meets the patient, he also asks him whether he has license to cannabis or not. Of course, he is the doctor that gives the cannabis. He add it to the file of the patient. And now, actually, we have files of patients that next to their blood counting and blood pressure and whatever there is in the patient file, there is documentation that they have license to cannabis, what kind of cannabis they use, what strain, what dose, and this is the way we start to deal with it in our hospital. And this way, actually, if you would like to study whether cannabis may influence the disease pattern, for example, you can go. We have a system here that you can go into these files, but anonymously. We don't know the name of the patient or his ID or anything, and study whether and compare, for example, people for rheumatoid arthritis that have license to cannabis and compare it to people who doesn't use cannabis, okay, and see the pattern of their disease anonymously. And this is the way we're trying to develop it in our hospital, to have kind of follow-up. And of course, we will continue to try to gain more data and start to establish a system for a kind of live follow-up. So to talk with the people or to ask the doctor to look better at their files and the interaction and the relationship between the cannabis and the pattern of the disease.
Okay, so, oh, we're still talking. No, it's just a delay. Okay. There may be other questions. I shouldn't dominate this. Yes.
Look, I've got a couple of questions on mental health. There is a line of thought, and I'd like to hear your views on it, that the recreational use of cannabis can, in vulnerable people or dose-related, I'm not really sure, and I'm happy to hear I'd like to hear your views on it, end up leading a person into mental health disorders, schizophrenia and so forth. So if you accept that, and I don't know whether you do or not, then it seems very sort of strange that then the same drug or the same chemical can be prescribed for the same thing that led these people into some sort of mental health condition. So that's one of my questions. Another one of my questions is your dose and addiction. how do you control addiction in a substance which has been, I think, shown to have some sort of addictive quality? So there's some of my questions. Thank you.
Could I answer?
Yeah, Vicky, please go ahead.
Thank you. You've raised an important point, an issue. Out of the two, between the CBD and the THC, CBD is fair to say, and it's not the addictive part, and it's not the psychoactive component of medicinal cannabis. THC is the one that we have to be cautious of with dependency and can have the psychoactive effects, like, for example, that we see in street cannabis. Most of the street cannabis has very high THC levels, and often we don't know what those levels are because there's no control or regulation. And lower CBD, people take the THC for the high. And different strains of cannabis have varying concentrations of all the different types of cannabinoids. Whereas that's why medicinal cannabis products are preferred, because they're more regulated, they're produced by the sponsors in a way that what we call good manufacturing practice. We know what's in it, we know what dosage it is. And as I mentioned, I prefer to start with CBD first because it's the not and not going to lead to problems like you mentioned. Now, what we know street cannabis, it's the THC that can induce acute psychosis and psychiatric, particularly in the adolescent.
Oh, Vicky, sorry, sorry, Vicky, your audio is not being received very well over here at the moment. Sorry about that.
Yeah, I don't think it's me because Igal had the same problem.
No, yeah.
And I actually.
I think I got most of your points, so maybe I can try and relay it for the audience here.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and correct me if I'm wrong on anything, Vicky. But I think what Vicky was saying is, first of all, you're right that especially high doses of cannabis over long periods of time can lead to some mental health issues, including dependence, and in people who have a predisposition for it, even emerge, psychosis and other, quite serious mental health conditions. And I think there was sort of two parts to Vicky's answer. The first one was that there's two main molecules in cannabis, THC and CBD. THC is what's found in recreational cannabis, and CBD doesn't cause any intoxication at all. And CBD has shown actually quite interesting promise in treating psychotic disorders. The other thing is the dose makes the poison is an old sort of adage from pharmacology. So someone who's using lots and lots of THC every day in a recreational situation is different to someone who's being prescribed small regular doses, in a controlled environment overseen by a healthcare professional. But you're right, it is an interesting coincidence. It is a bit strange. Yeah. Did that get your point across, Vicky?
Yes. And the high risk groups, for example, the adolescents, and where there's a family history of psychiatric problems, and they take cannabis that contains high THC, are the ones that are high risk. But that when we prescribe medicinal cannabis, we've got to take all those factors into consideration, not to prescribe it to a patient who has a strong family history of psychiatric problems, or if they've had psychiatric problems in the past, but particularly the THC. The CBD, as you said, is safe, and we do also use it in cases of psychosis, and there have been trials to show that it's helpful.
And I think it's also worth mentioning that it's the oversight of the healthcare professional, which is absolutely critical. So what is interesting in the medicinal cannabis space is that now that it can be prescribed by doctors and available, and it is a high quality product that meets the requirements of the TGA's good manufacturing practice, we're actually seeing a lot of patients come on board who have been self-medicating with cannabis historically, and to now have access to it through a medical system and have trusted product available is a terrific development. So that is a positive in the scheme of things, but it's the involvement with and oversight of a doctor that's a really important part of that process as well.
Just want to add
And it
one.
may even help to reduce the cannabis use, the street cannabis use.
It's one interesting phenomenon, and it's a paradox really. What you're saying is that the risk of the THC and the addiction, or the risk of the psychosis, which, you know, serious consequences, the CBD acts to reduce that. So if they're used in combination, it's actually almost an insurance policy of that risk not happening. So that's a really important point. So a lot of doctors
Correct.
are prescribing CBD and THC together to reduce
Yeah.
any risk of that negative consequence.
If you're smoking dope, wouldn't you be getting both anyway?
No.
Well, because
unless
you're buying it off the black market, you don't know what you're getting. Whereas if you're being prescribed medicinal cannabis through a medical system, the quality and the analysis of what you're receiving is well understood.
What's actually quite interesting is that in the plant itself, when the plant decides whether to produce CBD or THC, it's actually a trade-off that the plant makes. So plants that produce more THC have to produce less CBD, and vice versa. So because cannabis has been illegal and been produced for recreational purposes, recreational cannabis these days contains almost no CBD.
And I'd like to add that traditionally, you mentioned the word dope. I'm assuming this is a recreational product that's almost entirely THC. Yeah, and we actually have an interesting product from Israel called Argaman, which is a flower which is almost half CBD and half THC, which we've had quite a lot of success with.
Okay, we're nearing the end of the time, but I want to, just because we're fortunate enough to have Igal with us, like to just toss a final spanner in the works, Igal, and draw on your expertise. And that is an interesting paradox, and that is that you talked about inflammation and how effective CBD or cannabinoids can be in dampening down inflammation. You've also revealed to us that you're a cancer immunologist, and of course those of us who have treated cancer using immune therapies depend on an inflammatory response to treat cancer. And so there's a paradox there and a risk, I think, that by using an anti-inflammatory drug you could potentially interfere with immunotherapy of cancer. So would you like to address that interesting quandary?
Yes, it was actually a study that was done by Professor Barcela in our hospital. He studied the influence of people who had the license for cannabis and were treated with immunotherapy. And what he found that is that the activity of the cannabis reduced the efficacy and the efficiency of the immunotherapy drug. And today we do understand why it happens, because if CBD, for example, is anti-inflammatory, and in the immunotherapy process was actually was done in order to increase the immune system against the cancer. And now you take a drug that reduces the immune system, So it contradicts the activity of the therapy. And this is why we do have to be very accurate when we recommend to use cannabis. It's really dependent on the patient conditions and on the other drugs that we treat them. And this is only one example that was studied. Of course, now you can imagine, as I said in the beginning of my lecture, a 70 years old patient who takes maybe 10 different drugs, and now because he has a pain in the back, he also got licensed for cannabis. But nobody knows how the cannabis influence the activity of the other drugs. So we have to invest in studies to understand the drug-cannabis interaction or relationship. And we are only in the beginning of it.
Okay, so I think that's, unless there's any urgent additional questions from the floor, that's an important point to finish up on. The field shows enormous promise and hope, or hope and promise, but there's still an awful lot to be learnt. And thanks to researchers at centres such as Rambam, that work is being done, the knowledge is growing, and how to intelligently apply research to the clinical scenario and to use cannabis to benefit patients is an ongoing process, but needs to be informed by the sort of research that's being done both here and importantly in Israel. So, and on that note, I'd like to wrap up and thank everyone for your attention. Thank you.
All right. Good evening, all, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Australian Friends of Rambam, I thank our panel, both present and online, for your very much appreciated, insightful contribution to this evening's stimulating and thought-provoking discussion. I'm honored and pleased to present you with an Israeli potable token of our appreciation and gratitude, and sometime down the track, l'chaim. Now, before I finish, I want to say thank you to David over there. David is the gentleman who basically is the driving force behind this event and behind a lot of those events that we have. And in conclusion, we'd like to thank you for your attendance and generous donations, and remind you that we look forward to hosting you in future Circle of Health events to be held in this venue. Thank you very much. Toda rabba.